The note was written in pencil, in the careful, uneven letters of a child who had tried very hard to make it neat. It was taped to the bars of the last kennel in the row, low at a height an 8-year-old could reach, and below it a bright red card read, "Do not adopt. Evaluation hold," which everyone who worked at the county shelter knew was the polite way of saying that this dog's time had run out. Behind the bars, an old German shepherd lay with his gray muzzle flat on his paws, and his eyes were not on the people walking past. They were fixed on the door at the far end of the room, fixed on it steadily, patiently. The way a dog watches a door, he is certain someone is going to come back through. Senior Chief Petty Officer Beckett Rhodes had come to the shelter that cold morning to drop off a donation check and leave. He stopped at the last kennel only because the note was at eye level when he crouched to look at the old dog. He read 11 sentences in a little girl's handwriting, and then Beck Rhodes, who had walked away from a great many hard things in his life because the mission demanded it, discovered that he could not make his boots carry him toward the door. Before we go any further, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay with it until the very end. We read every single comment, and we'd love to know how far this one travels tonight. Beck Rhodes was 43 years old and 8 months out of the only life he had ever been good at. He was tall and weathered and built lean and hard, with short graying hair and a beard he hadn't bothered to trim since the funeral, and he carried himself with the contained stillness of a man who had spent 20 years learning to take up exactly as much space as a situation required and not 1 inch more. There was a pale scar along his right cheekbone and a deeper tightness around his eyes, which were a cold, clear gray, the eyes of a man who had spent a career scanning for the worst thing in any room and had never quite figured out how to switch it off. He was not unkind. Life had simply trained the softness in him to wait its turn. He spoke little. He kept his word completely, and he had been, for 8 months, a man quietly coming apart in the silence that follows a career, because the partner who had carried him through the last decade of it had died in his arms the previous spring. He had done 5 deployments with a SEAL team, the last 3 with a Belgian Malinois named Koa, who had walked point ahead of him into more dark rooms than Beck could stand to count. When the teams were done with both of them, Beck had adopted the dog, and for 2 good years it had been just the 2 of them in a quiet house. 2 retired warriors learning how to live without a war. Then Koa's heart had given out on a Tuesday with his head in Beck's lap, and Beck had buried him under the oak in the yard and had not, since, been able to fill the hole the dog left. He'd stopped sleeping right. He'd stopped seeing the point of much. He had walked into that shelter to write a check in Koa's memory and walk back out into his empty life, because looking too long at the dogs hurt in a way he wasn't ready for. He had not planned to crouch at the last kennel. He had not planned to read a child's note. He certainly had not planned for what reading it would do to him. The note read, in the careful pencil print of a girl just learning cursive, "Dear Bear, I am sorry we had to leave you here. It is not because we do not love you. Mom lost her job and the new apartment does not allow dogs, even good ones, even heroes. I told the lady at the desk that you are not a regular dog. I told her you barked and barked the night of the fire until you woke us all up, and that Mom carried baby Noah out and you would not leave until we were all on the grass. I told her you saved our whole family. She said she was sorry, but rules are rules. I come every day after school so you will not be lonely and so you will know we did not forget you. Please do not be scared. I am being brave so you can be brave too. I love you more than anything. Love, Emma." And underneath, in smaller letters, as if she'd added it later and pressed too hard, "P.S. I am still trying to find a way." The dog the note was written for was named Bear, and he was 11 years old, and his time had, in the cold arithmetic of an overcrowded shelter, officially run out. He was a big German shepherd of the old heavy build, 100 pounds gone soft and gray now, his muzzle white, his hips stiff. A patch of fur along one shoulder grown back lighter than the rest, where it had been singed away. He did not bark in the kennel. He did not lunge at the bars for attention the way the younger dogs did. He lay with his chin on his paws and watched the door, every day, all day, because a little girl had told him she would come. And a dog like Bear takes a promise more seriously than most men do. He had been at that shelter 11 weeks. Nobody adopts an old 100-pound shepherd with bad hips. And so the red card had gone up on his kennel, and the only living soul who knew it was a stranger in a field jacket who had stopped to read a note he was never supposed to see. The shelter was a low concrete building on the edge of a hard-luck part of town. and inside it had all the particular weariness of such places. The smell of bleach over the deeper smell it never quite covered, the chorus of barking from the runs, the fluorescent light that turns 10 in the morning into the same gray nowhere as 10 at night. Outside, a January sleet ticked against the windows over a parking lot full of the kind of cars people drive when every dollar is spoken for. It was a place where things slipped through cracks and were not caught, where a hero could end up on a kill list because his family had been knocked down a flight of stairs they had done nothing to deserve. And the man who had done the knocking went by Royce Tatum. Royce Tatum owned 40-some rental units across the poorer side of the city, and he had built his money the way that kind of money is so often built, by spending nothing on the people who had nothing, and by knowing that the poor almost never have a lawyer. He let the buildings rot. He ignored repair requests until they stopped coming. He kept security deposits on invented pretexts and raised rents past what the law allowed and evicted, fast and often illegally, anyone who complained, because a tenant who's been put out on the street rarely has the time or the money to fight back. He'd been doing it for years, and he had never once been made to answer for any of it. And he had come to believe, the way such men do, that the rules were simply things that happened to other people. He had a saying he liked, delivered with a shrug to anyone who pushed. "I'm not a charity. They don't like the conditions. There's the door. Somebody'll always take the unit." He said it smiling. And 8 months before Beck Rhodes read a little girl's note, Royce Tatum's refusal to fix the wiring in a second-floor unit, wiring that a tenant named Sarah Bennett had complained about in writing 4 separate times, had finally done what bad wiring does, and a fire had started in the walls of that apartment at 2 in the morning while a family slept. Sarah Bennett was 34, and she was the kind of person the world keeps knocking down precisely because she refuses to stop getting up. She worked 2 jobs. She kept her 2 kids clean and fed and in school on almost nothing. She was raising 8-year-old Emma and 2-year-old Noah alone, and she carried it all with a straight back and a quiet dignity that never once asked anyone for pity. The night of the fire, it was the family dog who saved them, Bear, barking and dragging at the blankets until Sarah woke choking on smoke, and she had grabbed the baby in Emma's hand, and Bear had herded them down the stairs and out onto the frozen grass and had not stopped circling them until every one of them was accounted for. They lost almost everything they owned that night. And then, in the weeks after, Royce Tatum lost no time at all. Rather than make the repairs or face the complaints Sarah had on record, he moved to be rid of the tenant who could testify that he'd known about the wiring. He refused to return her deposit, declared the unit uninhabitable due to tenant negligence in a lie that flipped the truth on its head and pushed the family out. The only place Sarah could find and afford on no notice was a cramped unit across town with a strict no pets rule. And so the dog who had carried her children out of a burning building had to be surrendered to a county shelter because the man whose neglect had started the fire had taken even that from them. Emma had been leaving notes ever since. Beck Rhodes adopted Bear that morning before he did anything else. He did not deliberate. He paid the fee, signed the papers, watched a shelter tech peel the red card off the kennel with visible relief, and walked an old gray shepherd out into the sleet on a borrowed leash. And Bear walked beside him with the steady manners of a dog who had been loved and trained by good people. That stopped the clock. It did not solve the problem, because the problem was not that Bear needed a home. Bear had a home and a family, and an 8-year-old who came after school every day to a kennel that was now empty, who would arrive that very afternoon to find her dog simply gone, and would have no way of knowing he hadn't been put down. Beck got the surrender paperwork from the shelter, and the name on it, and an address, and he drove across town through the sleet to find a little girl named Emma before she could come and find an empty cage. He found the Bennetts in a 3rd-floor walk-up with a child's drawings taped to a water-stained wall, and he met Sarah at the door, wary, exhausted, braced for one more piece of bad news, and he told her plainly who he was and what he'd done and why. And when Emma came out from behind her mother and saw the big gray dog standing in the hallway, the sound she made was not one Beck Rhodes was going to forget, and Bear's whole back end started going, his tail and his hips and his old gray body, and he pressed his face into the little girl who had promised she would find a way, and Beck had to look at the ceiling for a moment to keep his composure. But the joy didn't last past the practical, because the family still had nowhere that Bear could legally stay, and over coffee Sarah told him the rest of it. The fire, the wiring she'd reported 4 times, the eviction, the deposit, Royce Tatum, and Beck Rhodes, who had come unmoored 8 months before and had been waiting without knowing it for something worth setting his shoulder against, felt the old operator in him come fully awake for the first time since he'd buried Koa under the oak. He was not, it turned out, done being useful after all. He went to work the way he'd been trained to. He found a tenants' rights attorney who'd been trying to build a case against Royce Tatum for 2 years and had never had a tenant brave enough and stable enough to anchor it. He tracked down Sarah's 4 written complaints about the wiring, time-stamped, ignored. He found the fire marshal's report, which had quietly attributed the blaze to an electrical fault in the wall, the very fault Sarah had reported, and an investigator who had been frustrated for months that nothing had come of it. He found other tenants, a half-dozen of them, evicted and cheated by the same man in the same ways, who had assumed, each alone, that nothing could be done. Bear stayed with Beck through it, and Beck drove the dog across town most evenings so Emma could sit on the floor and read to him the way she used to, the old shepherd's head in her lap, a borrowed hour of the family being whole. And the more Beck assembled, the clearer it became that this was not bad luck befalling one family. It was a pattern, and at the center of it was a man who had decided that poor people were simply cheaper to discard than to house safely. Tatum fought the way men like him fight, which is to say from behind a lawyer and a wall of paper. He denied the complaints had ever been received. He threatened Sarah with countersuits. He had the eviction upheld on a technicality and dared anyone to prove otherwise. And for a hard stretch, it looked as though he might simply outlast them all, the way he always had. And Sarah, who had done everything right and been punished for all of it, sat at her kitchen table one night with her face in her hands and said the thing the beaten down finally say, that maybe it was foolish to fight a man who always won. Bear crossed the small kitchen and laid his big gray head in her lap and held it there. And Emma climbed into the chair beside her mother, and Beck Rhodes looked at the 3 of them and the dog and made the quiet decision he'd made before in worse places, that this was not going to end the way the powerful man expected it to. The careful approach was over. They brought it into the open at a housing court hearing that the tenants' rights attorney had turned, with Beck's help, into something Royce Tatum had never once faced, a room full of witnesses. Beck came with the attorney, and the fire investigator with his report, and a journalist who had spent 2 weeks confirming every document, and 6 other tenants Tatum had cheated, and Sarah Bennett with her 4 time-stamped complaints in a folder, and an investigator from the city's code enforcement office who had been handed the whole pattern on a platter. When it was his turn, Beck stood and told the court who he was. 20 years in naval special warfare, 5 deployments, and then he laid the chain out flat and complete, the way you brief a command. The ignored wiring, the 4 written warnings, the fire that followed, the family who'd nearly burned alive, the retaliatory and unlawful eviction of the one tenant who could prove the landlord had known, the stolen deposit, and the 6 other families who'd been run through the same machine. The investigator confirmed the wiring finding. The journalist's recorder ran. The other tenants, one after another, stopped being afraid out loud. Royce Tatum did what men like Royce Tatum do when the paper they've always hidden behind is finally read into the record. He objected. He cited his rights and his lawyer and the upheld eviction. He said it was a sad story but not his fault, that tenants damage units and invent grievances, that this was a great deal of emotion over a routine landlord-tenant dispute. And Beck Rhodes simply let him talk, because the more a man like that says in a room that has already turned, the deeper he digs. And when Tatum had finished, the silence answered him. The Code Enforcement Office had a fire marshal's negligence finding and a stack of identical complaints. The city attorney's office, which had received the complete file that morning, had questions that no lawyer was going to talk Royce Tatum out of answering. There was no shouting. There rarely is. Just a man who had grown rich off people who had nothing being walked out of a courthouse past the families he'd ruined, while a seal stood with his hand resting on the head of an old gray dog and felt nothing that resembled triumph, only the deep, clean quiet of a thing that had been wrong for a very long time finally being set right. By the following summer, the account had settled the slow, honest way real accounts do. Royce Tatum was charged in connection with the criminal negligence that caused the fire and named in a civil action that stripped away far more than he'd ever stolen. His units were placed under court-ordered inspection and brought up to code or seized, and the tenants he'd cheated The Bennetts among them were made whole with the back deposits and damages they were owed. Sarah Bennett used the settlement and a fresh start to move her family into a small rented house on a quiet street. A real house with a yard and a lease that welcomed dogs. And Bear went home. The old shepherd who had watched a shelter door for 11 weeks waiting for a little girl, who had carried that little girl out of a burning building when he was already old, who had been surrendered because a rich man's greed had taken even him. Bear went home to Emma for good. On a warm gold evening that July, Beck Rhodes sat on the steps of the Bennetts' new little house and watched Emma sit cross-legged in the grass reading aloud to an old gray dog. Sprawled contentedly in the last of the sun, she still wrote him notes, she told Beck so shyly. But the notes were different now. They were about her day and the cartoons she liked and how Noah had learned a new word. Ordinary happy things read out loud to a dog who had earned 1,000 ordinary happy evenings. Bear's tail moved slow and easy through the grass as she read, and his eyes, which had spent 11 weeks fixed on a shelter door, were closed now, untroubled. Home. Beck had found something on the other side of that note, too. He'd kept showing up, fixing the porch step, teaching Emma to throw a ball the right way. And somewhere in the keeping of a stranger's family safe, he had filled the hole that losing Koa had carved in him. He had walked into a shelter 8 months adrift, planning to drop off a check and leave. He had read 11 sentences in a child's handwriting instead, and he had not walked away, and it had given a dog back his family and given a lost man back his life. Sometimes the most powerful words in the world are not spoken by the powerful at all. Sometimes they are printed in careful pencil by an 8-year-old who is being brave so that someone she loves can be brave too. Taped low on the bars of a cage where the world had decided no one would ever read them. We walk past so much. We tell ourselves the cracks people fall through are too wide for one person to close. But God has a way of setting the right pair of eyes in front of the right note at the exact moment a child has run out of other ways to be heard. And He reminds us, through a stranger who refuses to keep walking, that the whole course of a life can turn on whether one person stops, reads the words, and decides they cannot leave them unanswered. No quiet plea is ever truly lost. Sometimes it only needs one person willing not to walk away. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that one person who refuses to walk past can change everything. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And tell us, has there ever been a moment when you stopped for someone the rest of the world walked by? Your words tonight might be the light somebody is waiting for. And if you believe in stories of loyalty, courage, and promises kept to the smallest among us, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, watch over every faithful creature waiting behind a door for someone who promised to come back, and remind you always, your words are heard, your kindness matters, and you are never ever alone.